something profoundly important about themselves and about friendship, right? At 2b, note the dialogue-like quality reminds us of Plato, right? Note the real-life example as well. For example, several times in this essay, he will talk about things that happened for him. He even mentions Gaius Paparus, a friend of his, who he had to stand up against, and he said, it was hard to do it, but I had to do it. At 3a, well, for you, what are the best texts of friendship? I mean, some will say from the Bible, Jonathan and David. Some will say Hamlet and Horatio, from Horatio. Remember that comment that Hamlet makes to Horatio? He says, you're a just person. You really are a good guy. And some will, of course, see Samwise Gamgee's, and Frodo as being the classics example of true friends in the Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, and of course Tolkien's novel as well. Finally, at 3b, what is your view on friendship? Jot that one down. Do you agree or disagree with the things that Cicero's just said? Are you a good friend to the people who you call friends, and are they true friends for you? Have you made your worst mistakes maybe sometimes in friendship? Jot down if that's the case. And what's the best thing in terms of friendship that you ever did for someone? Well, let's move on now to the second of the two essays from the Harvard Classics. This one is from 44 BC on old age, and this is a true classic in every sense of the word. Check this out. Ben Franklin, who we talked about in Harvard Classics Lecture 2. Ben Franklin published this very essay, and it was the first classic text to be published in North America, scholars have pointed out. This is the classic text about aging and death. We think about Plato's Phaedo, and we'll come to that actually in this. I've given a lecture for Harvard Classics number 7 on Phaedo. We have lots of examples from classic Romans and Greeks in this as well, so we learned some pretty good history here. And I'm going to make the argument there's a reason why you as a young person need this essay. Old age, well, I mean, think about this. It's coming for you, so it makes sense maybe to begin to prepare for it. But think about it this way. You are old to 5-year-olds. I mean, granted, you seem young to 50-year-olds, but to 5-year-olds look at you and they see you as old. And you did, of course, you saw high school seniors as old as well, right? Okay. In terms of, I think, the other thing is that this essay helps young people to respect, old age. I mean, sometimes old people will say about you guys, you just don't have any respect anymore. Cicero would, I'm sure, agree with that because that's always been the case. That's always been said of young people. They don't respect old people, right? Of course, we pointed this out before. On your way out of here, for example, if some 5th grader were to say to you, hey, sit down, I need to talk to you, your instincts are to go, whoa, 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 you don't get to talk to me like that. Because I am a high school senior, you are a 5th grader, I talk to you, you don't talk to me. Of course, it shames us to have to realize that when we say to our parents, I need you to hear what I'm saying to you because it's important, your parents just see you as that 5th grader. And they always will on one count, unless, of course, they make a mental decision to think otherwise. I think an essay like this, though, helps us to respect the idea that as we age, we should have certain views, and when we're young, we should have views towards those who age. Now, I think there's a good argument as well that the aged, whoever that is, and that's always a debate and relative, and we'll hear that even in this essay. We all need to read this essay as we age as well, right? We have a tendency to forget as we age that there's still work to do because we live in especially a capitalist culture that will retire us at some point, right? I mean, for example, I can't teach in 303 forever. At some point I got to walk out the door and somebody else comes in here and probably will definitely be younger than me and, take over. That's the nature of the culture that we live in. And of course, we live in a culture, as Yeats says in Sailing to Byzantium, that is no country for old men. It's for the young, the young in one another's arms, right? And all of that. There's going to be a lot of references in this essay, in this lecture, to Tennyson's Ulysses, old age hath yet its honor, it's told, death closes all but something ere thee, and some work of noble no be yet be done, none of them can be men that stroke of God. You can go back and look at my Ulysses lecture, Tennyson's Ulysses lecture in the senior B folder on LearnStrong.net. Think about the T.S. Eliot great line, right? Old men ought to be explorers. That's a wonderful one as well. I think so much of those ideas are subsumed in the study of this essay. This essay, really, really important essay, and I think if there's a single Cicero essay that you should read, it's this one, so I'm going to really work with it for a few seconds here. Let's do a brief overview. This is a speech that Cicero attributes to Cato the Elder. to a couple of young people, Scipio Africanus and Lolitas Sabinus. And both of these young people, of course, are asking about, what's it like to get old? It's kind of like in Republic 1, when the old man, Socrates, asks the even older man, Cephalus, what's it like to be old? And Cephalus, of course, says, it's great if you have money, right? Because then you can pay off all your debts and all the people that you heard. Go back and look at that lecture if you want to hear that one. Cicero was 63, actually, when he wrote this, and he addressed this essay to his friend Atticus, which we're going to hear a lot about Atticus later, because lots of the letters were written to his pal. And the reality is that while Cato does all the talking, it really is Cicero. So we usually kind of just say this is Cicero's views on old age. Now there's 4 disadvantages that most young people will say, man, what's the great line from Roger Daltrey, the lead singer along with Pete Townsend of The Who, hope I die before I get old, right? Talking about my generation. There's 4 disadvantages to getting old, usually accorded. 1, old age, we're going to go over these, right? Old age it withdraws us from active pursuits. You got to resign basically your job or retire or whatever. And we know what retire means in NASCAR, right? That means you get to put on new tires, which is probably the better way to think about that word, retire. But in our culture, of course, retire usually means, okay, nice job, you work, now you don't get to work anymore. And this is one thing that old age brings. Old age brings, of course, your body gets weaker and start to deteriorate the older that you get. Everything sags and bags, to use the language, right? To use the language of 303. The third one is old age deprives us of almost all of our physical pleasures. Sex comes to mind, but it's everything else as well, right? Your smell goes away, so you really can't enjoy good meals, etc., etc. You have stomach problems and all that kind of stuff. Talk to anybody over the age of 50, and he or she will usually start telling you that, yeah, I don't care how much you train and work out, sooner or later, it's like your body just starts to break down. That's the third one. And finally, number 4, old age. Well, the longer you live, the closer you get to the time that you have to leave that park and swing and go in the van, as we've talked about before. Right? I don't want to go to the van. I want to stay and swing at the park. No. You got to go to the van. Everybody's got to die. Well, the older you get, the less time you have to stay alive, and you can begin to kind of worry and fret about the fact that you don't have much time left. Now, what Cicero's going to do is he's going to respond to each of these disadvantages with a really optimistic spin. It's all about, of course, he's going to say your perspective or your attitude. So let's get into it now. Turn to the essay. I wish that I could read all of this with you. I mean, I can't, but I wish that I could. So let's go ahead and go to it here really quickly, and we'll kind of work through the ways in which this essay, I think, can speak to all kinds of issues. So let's go to it really quickly. First of all, the first idea. Old age withdraws us from active pursuits. In other words, you basically become useless when you get old, right? And the way this one's going to start for us is, he says, old age withdraws us from active employments. This is passage 6. We're going to jump back to 5 in a second. From which of them? Do you mean from those carried on by youth and bodily strength? Are there then no old men's employments to be after conducted by the intellect, even when bodies are weak? Now again, Cicero is going to spend most of his time, all of his time really, talking about old men getting old, but of course we could say the same of old women as well. He says old people remain active when they get old, just in different ways. And the way this essay actually begins is with Maximus, and he says it this way: what is then the purpose of a long disquisition on Maximus? He says it's because you now see that an old age like his cannot conscientiously be called unhappy. Yet it is after all true that everybody cannot be a Scipio or a Maximus, with stormings of cities, with battles by land and sea, with wars in which they themselves commanded, and with triumphs to recall. Besides, there is a quiet, pure, and cultivated life which produces a calm and gentle old age, such as we have been told Plato's was, who died at his writing desk, his 81st year. Plato dies writing, the myth is. Or like Isocrates, who says that he wrote the book called the Panegyric in his 94th year, who lived for years afterwards, while his master Gorgias completed 107 years without ever relaxing his diligence or giving up work. We're going to hear this a lot, these examples or these models of amazing people who have lived into old age and have done remarkable things. When someone asked him why he consented to remain so long alive, he said, I have no fault to find with old age, which Cicero says was a noble answer. The next thing that he'll tell us is that the mind and the experience of old age. There is therefore nothing in the arguments of those who say that old age takes no part in public business. They are like men. He says old men, especially now he's talking about politics because he served in a life of politics. They're like men, this is a wonderful simile, like men, old people, who say that a steersman does nothing in sailing a ship, because while some of the crew are climbing the masts as they're hurrying up and down the gangways, others pumping out the bilge water, he sits quietly at the stern holding the tiller. I mean, think about a pilot of a ship, right? I mean, everybody's running around doing all this work, and he's kind of guiding the ship, and yet who's the most important person on the ship? Obviously the pilot, right? Doesn't run us into a rock or something. He does not do what young men do. Nevertheless, he does what is much more important and better. The great affairs of life are not performed by physical strength or activity or nimbleness of body, but by deliberation, character, expression of opinion, right? Reflection and judgment, in other words. In other words, the argument is, as you age, you should become not just more knowledgeable, but wiser, right? And therefore, actually more useful to a community. Now, we're obviously going to ask this question in 3b here later. Have times changed? And this is one of the hallmarks of modernity and post-modernity, that in an ancient classical age, like Cicero's writing during an age, when people give more reverence and veneration to the aged. Is that the case? I'm not sure about that, because it seems to me that hiding behind this essay, this dialogue, is in fact a statement about what's the point of old people. I mean, what are they really good for anyway? And so Cicero's got to write an essay like this, right? Let's keep going. He says, there's problems obviously with memory. But it said memory dwindles when you get old. No doubt, unless you keep it in practice, or you happen to be somewhat dull by nature. He says, I don't have any fear of losing my memory. And he says, in point of fact, he says, I've ever heard of any old man, have I ever heard of any old man forgetting where he's hidden his money? In other words, we continue to have good faculty, good memory into our old age about the things that matter to us, right? He continues, he says, old men retain their intellects well enough if only they keep their minds active and fully employed. Nor is it that the case only with men of high position and great office. It applies equally to private life and peaceful pursuits. Sophocles composed tragedies to extreme old age, and then he even mentions I made these comments when I was doing Greek drama, that Sophocles wrote Oedipus at Colonus when he was quite old, and there was some debate about whether he was losing his mind. It seems that some people in his family were trying to take stuff away from him or something, and he was able to stand up and recite lines from his plays, and was able to show that, you know, I still have a good memory, and therefore I'm still active, I'm still virile, and all of that. We continue with this one, and he will give he gives a great list: Pythagoras, Plato, Zeno, all these great, Diogenes, all these great philosophers who lived to be quite old. And he says, is it not rather the case with all these that the active pursuit of study only ended with life? So let's put this one in our notes. This is a big one for Cicero. He says, if you don't want to get old as you age, then continue to learn. What we call, of course, today, lifelong learning and the importance of study. And finally, he says it this way: delight in them is nearer the mark than dislike. For just as old men, if they are wise, take pleasure in the society of young men of good parts, and as old age is rendered less dreary for those who are courted and liked by the youth, so also do young men find pleasure in the maxims of the old, by which they're drawn to the pursuit of excellence. Nor do I perceive that you find my society less pleasant than I do yours, for this is enough to show you how, so far from being listless and sluggish, old age is even a busy time, always doing and attempting something, of course, of the same nature as each man's taste had been in the previous part of his life. Nay, do not even some add to their stock of learning. And he mentions Solon as a classic example. I think this is a fascinating idea. He says, there's a symbiotic relationship between the young and the old. The old take care of the young when the young are young. As the young become themselves old, then they should turn around. It's the same thing that seniors obviously expect of freshmen. Show some respect. Obviously, freshmen don't often want to give seniors respect because they think they know everything, right? And of course, seniors have to remind them. I've been through the freshman, sophomore, junior experience. You haven't, and therefore, you might want to consider what I have to say, even though I'm aware that it's possible that some of what I have to say you don't want to listen to. It's a fascinating idea. The second observation is that old age makes the body weak. The way it's said is this. He says, do I now miss the bodily strength of a young man, for which the second point, he says, has been raised? You should use what you have, and whatever you may chance to be doing, do it with all your might. Sounds like a biblical text. What could be weaker than Milo of Corton's exclamation when in his old age he was watching some athletes practicing in the course? He said to have looked at his arms and to exclaim with tears in his eyes, "Oh well, these are now as good as dead." And of course, older athletes have to deal with the fact of, you're right, that younger athletes can be bigger, stronger, faster, or whatever. But I mean, you could probably jot down right now a 3B of an athlete who comes to mind, who is not physically young and yet has this amazing ability to continue to perform at a remarkable level into the old age. I mean, obviously, if you follow football, you know a lot's been made of the fact that Tom Brady is still playing football, and he's not young anymore, and yet he's still got that keen mind and the body that goes with it, right? One of the interesting things that Cicero says as being a speaker is that your voice actually seems to kind of grow and age in beautiful ways as you get older, and you can become an even better teacher. He says, what is more charming than old age, surrounded by the enthusiasm of youth? I'm reminded of a line like this as I lecture you guys. Shall we not follow old age, even the strength to teach the young, to train and equip them for all the duties of life? And what can be a more nobler employment? Wow. So in other words, he makes the observation that, Mr. McGee is a better instructor after I've done it for a long time because I'm getting older. I guess that's an interesting question in 3B. Do you find that's the case, that as teachers get older, they get better? Some people have said not always so much, right? He goes on to talk about how your body, when you're young, you can make some stupid choices which then follow you into your old age, right? He says, yet that same failure of the bodily forces is more often brought about by the vices of youth than of old age. For a dissolute and intemperate youth hands down the body to old age in a worn-out state. In other words, if you are too hard on your body, this is one of the biggest arguments, by the way, for when you're young, not partying to excess and the like, because you will pay for it later in your life. Talk to old people who did it a lot when they were young, and they will tell you that is the case. Cicero is going to make that argument. He makes a really poetic observation about everything has its season, which will sound a whole lot like the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, especially Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time for everything. How about this one? Which then of the two would you prefer to have given to you? This is a fun question to ask young people. Bodily strength like that, or intellectual strength like that of Pythagoras, right? In fine, enjoy that blessing which you have when it's gone, when you have it. When it's gone, don't wish it back, unless we're to think that the young men should wish their childhood back and those somewhat older their youth. By the way, this is an interesting observation. He says, as you age, don't wish that you could get young again and go back and be young again. We live in a culture, of course, that prides itself on looking beautiful and young, and so this might be an interesting observation to those of us who would wish that we could go back and look young again. He says, the course of life is fixed, and nature admits of its being run, but in one way, and only once. And in each part of our life, there's something specially seasonable, so that the feebleness of children, as well as the high spirit of youth, the soberness of mature years, the ripe wisdom of old age, all have a certain natural advantage, which should be secured in its proper season. What a fascinating idea, right? The idea that everything kind of, it has its point. What does that mean? That I sit on a couch and just wait to die? No, actually quite the opposite. He says, my dear Lelius and Scipio, we must stand up against old age. This is in passage 11. So, you can hear what he's saying. I mean, yeah, you got to die, but you got to stand up against it. Don't get old too early before your time. He says it this way. We must stand up against old age and make up for its drawbacks by taking pains. We must fight it as we should an illness. Interesting idea. We must look after our health, use moderate exercise, take just enough food and drink to recruit, but not to overload our strength. Nor is it the body alone that must be supported, but the intellect and soul much more. for they are like lamps. It's an interesting simile. Unless you feed them with oil, they too go out from old age. It's a to be. What a great simile. Write that one down. Basically, he's saying what we've said in our lectures on energy conservation when we talked Thoreau's Walden. He's saying you need to take care of the energy that you have. If you expend too much of it when you're young, when you get old, you won't have the energy. I think another argument, and you maybe can play this one out with the teachers who are older, who you think maybe have kind of, they've lost their edge. Think of it this way. We have a tendency to forget quickly what it was like to be young. And I think often when I speak with teachers, I will remind them of this. We, as teachers, have a tendency to forget what it was like to be young. And so we kind of can grow quickly bitter about that. We'll have more to say about that one in a little bit, right? Finally, he says it this way about needing to stay focused on living. He says, but what makes me capable of doing this is my past life. He says, I'm young and virile, but I'm old and virile. I still have strength, but there's a reason. It's because of the choices I made when I was young. For a man who is always living in the midst of these studies and labors does not perceive when old age creeps upon him. Thus, by slow and imperceptible degrees, life draws to its end. There's no sudden breakage. It just slowly goes out. In other words, he says, if you remain busy and focused and working all your life, then when death finally comes, old age and death finally come, it kind of creeps up on you. You didn't even see it coming. You're like, oh, I guess I got older. Wow. Point number 3, old age deprives us of our physical pleasures. He says the third charge against old age is that it lacks sensual pleasures, passage 12. What a splendid service does old age render if it takes us from the greatest blot of youth. Now, Cicero is going to go off on the idea that when you're young, what is it Yeats says in St. Anthony, that is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations of their song. Young people, of course, are very excited and